I was living in Louisville, Kentucky when we first adopted our infant daughter from Korea. I was, of course, married at that time, as hard as that may be for some of you all to believe who know me best. But yes, there was a period of my life when I actually was. We had to endure a number of rather peculiar questions about our decision, some of which were insanely personal and others of which were just stupid. I will not reveal which family member asked us if we planned to tell our very Asian daughter that she was adopted. But even more, the strangest inquiries came from total strangers, and it really started to wear on me. One day when Valerie was more than a year old and had come into her beautiful long black Korean hair, her mother and I were grocery shopping with Valerie riding in the cart, and a woman just came up beside us and asked, "What a beautiful child. Did you adopt her?" Being weary of such impromptu invasions of privacy, without answering the woman, I turned to my wife and said, "See, no one thinks she looks like me. Isn't there something you want to tell me?" My former wife did not universally enjoy my sense of humor, but that day when that woman grabbed her purse and left her cart behind and sprinted for the front door, even she enjoyed my extemporaneous "why don't you just mind your own business" lessons. It's not really part of my job as a pastor to teach "why don't you mind your own business" lessons, but it's just a free service that I provide. There are things that are so obvious that they shouldn't have to be said, and yet we end up saying them. And oftentimes, even after we've said them, it still doesn't take. I'm reading a new book that I recommend to you very highly. It's written by an Episcopal priest who was previously unknown to me. His name is Harry Cook, and the book is entitled "Long Live Salvation by Works." I was first drawn to this book by a single quote emailed to me from a friend. Cook says, "It is an axiom of human behavior that you cannot reason a person out of a position he did not reason himself into in the first place. However, a person who did reason himself into a position might be reasoned out of it and into another, more reasonable position." That single sentence sums up a lot of what I have found difficult in my life as a religious person and as a religious teacher. There's so much about religion that we do not arrive at by reason. We are told to believe certain things. We are told to believe them emphatically. We are sometimes even told that if you stop believing them, that you will go to hell. You would not, through observation of the world or through any personal experience, come to believe in the divinity of Jesus or the sanctity of sacraments. You would not reason your way into believing in incarnation or heaven or hell or substitutionary death. And so when we try to apply reason to the practice of our spirituality, we find ourselves constantly at odds with those who refuse to allow reason to be a part of their religious decision-making. Religious people are so often like the Queen in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, when Alice objected, "There's no use trying, one can't believe impossible things." And the Queen said, "I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." I'm afraid in churches we've asked children to believe 6 impossible things in Sunday school. Lewis Carroll, of course, was not simply writing humor for children, because once you get a person practiced to believe impossible things, then you can get them to believe almost anything and do almost anything. And I'm afraid a lot of our early religious training simply worked to anesthetize our ability to do critical thinking. And it's interesting how much people become invested in avoiding critical thinking. They tried to include in the curriculum of Texas public schools a critical thinking course, which, you know how I feel about Texas. That's a good thing. But the Texas Republican Party put as part of their platform objecting to teaching critical thinking because it could result in abandoning traditional values. Can you imagine? Opposing teaching critical thinking skills. Now, sometimes we miss a lot of what even the Bible says because we've been trained to look at it as if it were a book of magic spells. It becomes so holy in our minds that it becomes incomprehensible. And you can read it in public, and sometimes even when what it says is very plain, we don't understand it. We think we don't understand it because we always tend to hear it as holy writ. We tend to think of the word prophet to mean someone who has a divine insight into the future, sort of a saintly Nostradamus. That's not at all true. The prophets rarely foretold the future. There are some instances where Old Testament prophets are predicting the future, but that's not really what they were about. In almost every case, they talked about the present moment and maybe next week or next month. The meaning of the word prophesy is no different from the meaning of the word preach. To prophesy is to preach. In almost every instance where it's used in the Bible, that's exactly what it means. The prophets were said to speak in a way that made people's ears tingle. That was not because they were talking about rise or fall of the future stock market. It was something that made them want to cover their ears because it was too painful to hear. They weren't foretelling the distant future. They weren't predicting the coming of a later Messiah. They were talking about the present moment with such naked honesty that it made people want to put the preacher into prison or to kill them rather than to deal with what they were saying. We say now that the role of the prophetic church is to speak the truth to power. But you know, power rarely wants to hear what we have to say. It was the prophetic church that stood up to the abuses of our colonizers. It was the prophetic church that challenged the practices of child labor in the early textile industry. It challenged the institution of slavery. It challenged the relegation of women to second-class status, the labor abuses of immigrants and of defenseless workers. Now, institutional religion has a whole long laundry list of social justice issues in which they were almost always on the wrong side. But that's not because they were accustomed to speaking the truth. It's because institutional religion has been in the practice of believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. But the prophetic church, and there's always been some, the prophetic church has always been the one that challenged injustice and spoke the truth to power. The emerging church of the 21st century must stop asking people to believe what cannot be known and that which is inherently unreasonable. Faith is compatible with hope, but faith is not compatible with ignorance. The prophets were not magical diviners who had angels whispering in their ears. They were people who had the courage to speak the truth when nobody wanted to face the truth. You consider this text before us from the 5th chapter of Amos. And sure, he's pronouncing divine judgment. Prophets do that. But look at why. In verse 11, he says very clearly that their nation is going to fall apart. Look at what he says. Because you trample the poor. Not because you didn't believe the right things, or you weren't baptized the right way, or you didn't go to confession, or you didn't take the sacraments right. Not because you didn't have the right doctrines inside your head, but because you mistreat the poor. He says in verse 12 that they took bribes, that they pushed the needy away from the gate. Cannot the modern church hear the voice of their own prophets? Let me give you an example. And we've never talked about this one before, so this is kind of a clean slate issue. Let's just look at some facts about what's going on this year in an election year about voter suppression and voter fraud. There have been lobbyists working across the nation to to change voter laws to require that every voter present a photo ID. And it is estimated that 20 million voters do not have a voter ID, which is normally a government-issued picture ID, which is most commonly associated with owning a car. Now, of the 20 million people who don't own a car in the United States, how do you think they vote? Statistically, the 20 million people who don't own a car are the most likely to be the poor. They are the most likely to be urban minorities. So what we're really trying to do is to stop 20 million people from casting a Democratic ballot. By both instituting photo IDs and restricting pre-election day voting. I'm not going to be in the United States on election day this year, so I've already voted. In Missouri, you can do that. And they'll ask you why, but you can make up anything you want. I mean, in Missouri, you can vote, 6 weeks ahead of an election. But in a lot of states now, they're restricting that because it is part of the practice of the black church the Sunday before Election Day to bring buses and to take their church members out to vote en masse. So they're trying to suppress black votes. Now, how many cases of voter fraud do we typically have in the United States in a year? Do you have any idea? Just guess. How many substantial? Five last year, 80 over the last 5 years. So somewhere between 5 and 20 cases of voter fraud. You see, if you're interested in calling out the public to embrace the truth, can you possibly make yourself believe that we should take away voters' rights from 20 million people to stop 5 instances of voter fraud? Can you really make yourself believe that they're telling the truth, that what they're trying to do is to protect elections? This week, billboards began appearing in minority neighborhoods in Cleveland, Ohio, that read, "Voter fraud is punishable by 3.5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine." These billboards are only appearing in African American and immigrant neighborhoods in this all-important swing state. You can understand that there are people who are inspired to try to get Obama out of the White House, but once they decide that they can trample the poor in order to do that, then I think persons of conscience need to be willing to deal with the truth and not with the lies that mask the motivation. Now, Plato in the Republic advocated that philosophers should be kings. In our age, we could say, for example, that only people who have an IQ over 140 should be allowed to vote. So if only geniuses could run the government, we would have a very efficient and dependable government, right? But one of the interlocutors in Plato's Republic, once Socrates had described this wonderful state ruled only by philosopher kings, asked Socrates, but who would want to live there? An America run only by and for the rich, or an America run only by and for the elite, would not be an America that most of us would want to live in. As sloppy and inefficient as it is, the beauty of our nation is found in striving for a kind of equality among all people. Now, we're nowhere near there. As religious people, we can say that being rich is not a blessing and being poor is not a curse. But when you have lived on both sides of the fence of rich and poor, you can say with the pigs and Animal Farm that some of us are more equal than others. The traditional religious people want us to show kindness to the poor and the hungry and the sick as a kind of icing on top of our self-congratulatory religious beliefs that we are heaven-bound travelers on a sacred highway. The prophets asked us, rather, to be devoted to the absolute truth more than any dogma or religious ritual. In our very complicated world in which politicians play dice with deciding which sick people get to actually get health care and which people will live in mansions and which ones will live under bridges and who gets to vote and who doesn't get to vote, then we should be considered to be dangerous people because we will always tell the truth. We will always take the side of the inconvenient truth that challenges the powerful. And that devotion to compassion and reason becomes our sacred scriptures and our sacrament.
Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverend.drray@aol.com for more information.